The ice storm didn't ease in. It slammed down like a shut door. Power lines sagged, trees cracked under frozen weight, and the entire neighborhood of Frostvale Ridge went dark at once. The only sound cutting through the wind was my generator, steady and loud, keeping my house alive. It had to. My wife Emily depended on medical equipment that could not fail. And next door, Mrs. Eleanor Pike lay in bed with an oxygen concentrator that didn't care about HOA rules or noise complaints. That's when headlights swung into my driveway. Linda Hawthorne, the HOA board leader, marched straight toward me with 2 board members behind her, clipboard hugged to her chest like a weapon. She shouted that I was violating community quiet rules. I explained the storm. I explained the medical needs. I pointed at the oxygen line running next door. She didn't listen. She ordered me to shut the generator off. When I refused, she threatened police fines and immediate HOA action. A few hours later, while the storm howled and roads turned to ice, someone from the HOA utility committee flipped the shared transfer switch feeding my line. The generator died. The house went silent. Lives were suddenly on a countdown. I didn't scream. I didn't panic. I documented everything. And remembered something Linda never bothered to learn about how this neighborhood was built. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Before any of this happened, I honestly believed Frostvale Ridge would be a quiet reset. After everything my wife Emily went through, peace wasn't a luxury anymore. It was survival. I spent most of my career as an electrical systems technician, the kind of job where mistakes don't just cost money, they cost lives. You learn early to double, check, document, and never assume someone else knows what they're doing. When Emily finished her last round of treatment and finally started getting her strength back, we sold our old place and moved somewhere smaller, calmer, and supposedly predictable. That illusion lasted about a week. Linda Hawthorne introduced herself with a tight smile and a clipboard before she ever said hello. She talked fast, asked too many questions, and somehow managed to inspect my driveway, mailbox, and siding while pretending to welcome us. I didn't think much of it at first. Some people live for rules. Some people need control to feel important. I figured she'd lose interest once she realized I wasn't the type to argue over grass height. I was wrong. The first citation came over what she called unauthorized electrical modifications. According to her letter, my workshop wiring was unsafe and non-compliant. That would have scared most people. It didn't scare me. I pulled permits, inspection approvals, and county sign-offs, every document neatly labeled and dated. When the inspector came out, he confirmed everything was done by the book. Linda lost that battle publicly, right in front of 2 board members. She never forgave me for it. After that, the fines started coming in waves. Trash cans left out too long, snow not shoveled fast enough, a warning about visible equipment that somehow applied to my backup power transfer panel, but not the identical ones installed at board members' homes. Every notice carried the same tone, polite on paper, threatening underneath. Emily tried to shrug it off, but I could see the stress creeping back into her shoulders. Hospitals teach you what real fear feels like. Petty authority games shouldn't bring that back, but they did. When I installed the generator, everything escalated. It wasn't a vanity purchase. It was medical necessity. Emily's equipment needed stable power, and winter storms in this part of Wyoming don't ask permission. The generator was permitted, inspected, and installed by a licensed contractor. I even ran noise tests and documented decibel levels. Linda called it selfish. She told neighbors I was hoarding power. She claimed I refused to share electricity during emergencies, conveniently leaving out the part where generators have load limits and overloading them could shut everything down, including the oxygen concentrator next door. I tried explaining that to her once, slowly and clearly. She rolled her eyes and said, "You don't get to decide who deserves electricity." What made it worse was the hypocrisy. While she lectured me about fairness, I watched board members quietly run space heaters and illegal extension lines during earlier outages. Nobody cited them. Nobody threatened fines. The rules only seemed to matter when my name was on the envelope. As winter set in, the atmosphere changed. Roads iced over more frequently. Plows ran late. Emergency response times stretched thin. The HOA sent emails reminding everyone about quiet hours and exterior appearances, as if frozen asphalt and downed lines were minor inconveniences instead of real dangers. It felt like watching someone rearrange furniture while the house filled with smoke. The night the big storm hit, everything became clear. Power failed across the entire area within minutes. Cell service weakened. Trees snapped like gunshots in the dark. I started the generator automatically, checked Emily's equipment, then walked next door to make sure Mrs. Pike's oxygen was stable. She smiled at me the way people do when they're scared, but trying not to show it. That was the moment Linda chose to make a point. She didn't come to ask if anyone needed help. She came to assert control, standing there in the snow, shouting about quiet rules while medical equipment hummed behind me. She made it obvious this was never about safety or community. It was about obedience. When the HOA cut my generator line later that night, it stopped being harassment. It became dangerous. That silence, the sudden absence of power, the alarms switching to battery, the realization that someone with authority had chosen rules over human life, burned something into me. I wasn't dealing with a difficult neighbor anymore. I was dealing with someone willing to gamble with lives just to prove she could. And once I understood that, I stopped treating this like a dispute. I treated it like a system failure that needed to be handled correctly. Before more than power went out, Linda didn't back off after the generator went dark. She leaned in. By morning, an HOA emergency notice hit everyone's inbox. The subject line was bold and official, full of fake urgency. According to Linda, the board now held temporary authority over all generators to ensure fair use and community compliance during extreme weather. It sounded legal enough to scare people who didn't know better. Neighbors started knocking on my door, asking if they were about to lose power, if the HOA could really do that, if they were in trouble for running space heaters. Fear spreads faster than ice. Inside my house, the situation was deteriorating. Mrs. Pike's oxygen concentrator began chirping. That sharp, high-pitched alarm that means the battery is draining faster than it should. Every beep felt like a countdown. Emily tried to stay calm, but I could see her hands shaking as she helped me swap backup batteries and extension lines. The storm outside was still brutal, wind rattling the windows hard enough to make the frames groan. I called County Non-Emergency, explained the situation, explained the medical equipment, explained that an HOA had interfered with power during an ice storm. The dispatcher's voice stayed calm, but her words didn't help. Response times were delayed, roads were iced over, crews were stretched thin, help would come, just not fast. That's when I realized how close this was getting. I walked back outside and found Linda again near the entrance road, standing dry under an umbrella like weather was something that happened to other people. I told her about the oxygen alarms. I told her my wife's equipment was running on limited backup. I told her this wasn't about fairness or noise. This was about keeping people alive until the storm passed. She smirked. "Rules don't stop for weather," she said, like she was proud of it. Something shifted in that moment. Up until then, I'd still believed there was a line she wouldn't cross. I'd assumed reason would eventually land, But watching her stand there, comfortable and untouched by the consequences of her own decisions, I understood the truth. This wasn't ignorance, it was choice. I went back inside and closed the door, shutting out the wind and her voice. I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. Engineers learn early that arguing with a broken system doesn't fix it. You isolate the failure, trace the flow, and work the problem from the foundation up. While Linda obsessed over electricity, I thought about something else entirely. Water. Frostvale Ridge wasn't flat. It had never been. Every house sat at a different elevation, a detail most residents ignored until their basements flooded. Years earlier, while reviewing property surveys, I'd noticed something unusual on my lot, a sealed utility access point near the back fence. At the time, it was just a curiosity. A concrete lid with old markings, easy to forget. I didn't forget it now. Water doesn't care about authority. Titles or emergency notices typed in bold font. It follows gravity, pressure, and design always leaves fingerprints. I pulled out my laptop and started digging through county records, subdivision plans, anything I could access with a weak internet signal. The more I read, the clearer it became. Frostvale Ridge had been built with a centralized drainage control system for extreme weather events, a system meant to prevent backflow when pumps failed and power went out. And that system didn't answer to the HOA. It answered to whoever controlled the infrastructure. As Mrs. Pike's oxygen alarm chirped again from next door, I understood exactly how dangerous Linda's fixation had become. She thought power was the lever that controlled the neighborhood. She thought authority meant command. She was wrong. The real system that would decide who flooded and who stayed dry had nothing to do with noise rules or clipboards. It was buried, ignored, and designed long before Linda ever held a vote. And for the first time since the storm began, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was planning. Once I understood what Linda was really blind to, everything slowed down in my head. Panic stopped being useful. Fear turned into focus. Frostvale Ridge wasn't built randomly, and it definitely wasn't built flat. The entire subdivision sat on a long, gradual slope, with my property positioned at the highest elevation, a fact the realtor mentioned once and everyone promptly forgot. Everyone except me. I remembered the survey from when we bought the house. I had paid extra for a full land and utility review, not because I planned anything, but because old habits die hard. During that process, the surveyor pointed out a sealed concrete access point near the back of my yard, half hidden by snow most of the year. At the time, he called it legacy infrastructure and shrugged. Most people would have ignored it. I didn't. That night, while the storm still raged and Linda's emergency notice continued circulating like gospel, I went back there with a flashlight. I brushed ice off the lid and uncovered faded markings stamped into the concrete. This wasn't a random utility box. It was deliberate, heavy duty, built to be accessed when things went wrong. Inside the vault were 6 large manual valve wheels, each labeled by zone. Each zone fed drainage lines tied directly into basement sump systems across the neighborhood. It was old-school engineering, the kind that doesn't rely on electricity to work. During normal conditions, electric pumps did most of the work. But during outages and heavy melt, gravity took over, guided by these controls to prevent pressure buildup and backflow. In other words, this system decided who flooded and who didn't when power failed. I didn't touch anything. Not yet. Engineers don't move levers without understanding consequences. Instead, I went back inside and pulled county records again. This time focused on drainage and easements. The documents took time to load, but the answers were there, buried under decades of updates and neglect. The vault was legally on my land, not shared land, not AOA-controlled land. When the subdivision was built, the developer retained easement access for the county, not the HOA. At some point over the years, responsibility blurred, paperwork stopped being updated, and the HOA quietly started acting like it owned everything. It didn't. Linda never knew that, or if she did, she never bothered to verify it. Her authority ended where actual infrastructure law began. As I read through the emergency procedures attached to the original plans, something else clicked. This system wasn't meant for convenience. It was designed for triage. During severe conditions, flow could be restricted to protect critical zones first: medical needs, elderly residents, families with infants. Lower priority zones would experience slower drainage temporarily, not because of punishment, but because physics demanded choices when capacity was limited. This wasn't sabotage, it was disaster management, and it came with rules. Rules Linda never bothered to learn. She thought controlling my generator meant controlling the situation. She thought electricity was the choke point. But electricity is just one layer. Water is relentless. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care about HOA votes or emergency emails. It moves according to design and gravity, and whoever understands that design holds real influence. The more I read, the clearer it became that Frostvale Ridge had been relying on luck for years. No one had tested the manual controls. No one had reviewed the emergency protocols. No one had even confirmed who was authorized to operate them. The system existed, quietly waiting, while the HOA argued about trash cans and noise complaints. Linda tried to control my power. In doing so, she forced me to look deeper. She turned a petty authority grab into a situation that exposed how unprepared and reckless her leadership really was. If she hadn't escalated, I might never have opened that vault again. If she hadn't cut my generator line, I might never have reread those emergency documents with fresh urgency. Standing there in the cold, flashlight reflecting off steel valves older than the HOA itself, I realized something important. This wasn't about revenge. This was about responsibility. Someone had to operate the system correctly, because if nobody did, pressure would build, lines would back up, and flooding would happen anyway, uncontrolled, undocumented, and dangerous. I wasn't going to let that happen. Not to Mrs. Pike. Not to my wife. Not to families who didn't even realize how close they were to disaster. Linda believed authority came from a title and a clipboard. She believed rules were weapons you could swing without consequences. She never accounted for the fact that real systems don't answer to people like her. They answer to physics. And physics was firmly on my side. I didn't rush into anything. Acting fast feels good, but it gets people in trouble. I've spent too many years working around systems that punish impatience before I touched a single valve or made a single move. I picked up the phone and called County Emergency Management. It took a while to get through. Everyone was overwhelmed. When I finally reached Susan Hale, the county emergency coordinator, I laid everything out slowly and clearly. The ice storm, the widespread outages, the HOA interference with backup power, the medical equipment at my house and next door. Then I told her about the drainage system. The manual controls the elevation difference, and the fact that ice melt was coming whether anyone was ready or not. She didn't interrupt me. That told me everything. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. Then she asked the question that mattered most. Is the infrastructure accessible and intact? I told her it was. She explained that under emergency infrastructure guidelines, counties can authorize qualified volunteers to operate legacy systems when normal oversight fails, especially when lives are at risk, especially when the system sits on private land with documented easements. She asked about my background. I told her the truth. She asked if I understood liability, documentation, and chain of command responsibilities. I did. By the end of the call, I had written authorization: temporary, conditional, clear. I wasn't acting as a homeowner anymore. I was acting as a volunteer operator under emergency management, with one responsibility: reduce harm and prioritize life safety during a declared crisis. The next step was planning. I sat at the kitchen table while the wind rattled the house and built a triage map of the neighborhood. I didn't guess. I didn't assume. I used elevation data, drainage flow rates, and the original subdivision plans. I marked homes with medical needs first. Mrs. Pike, a family with an infant a few houses down. An elderly couple near the ridge who relied on powered mobility equipment. Those zones received full protection. Lower zones, the ones designed to handle delayed drainage, were marked accordingly, not shut off, not sabotaged, just managed within the limits the system was built for. Emergency management is about choices. When capacity is limited, you don't pretend everyone gets the same outcome. You protect the most vulnerable first. Before touching anything, I documented everything. I photographed each valve in its starting position with timestamps. I recorded video walkthroughs of the vault, narrating what I was doing and why. I installed battery-powered cameras aimed at the access point and each control wheel. Every movement would be logged, every adjustment traceable. This wasn't about secrecy. It was about accountability. I sent copies of my plan and documentation to Susan Hale's office and kept duplicates backed up off-site. I even wrote out contingencies. What I would do if the melt accelerated, what I would do if power partially returned, what I would do if someone tried to interfere. Only then did I begin operating the system. I turned valves slowly, incrementally, exactly as the emergency procedures described. No sudden changes, no dramatic gestures. Just controlled flow adjustments designed to reduce back pressure during the coming thaw. The system responded the way it was supposed to. Pressure equalized. Line stabilized. At no point did I target anyone. That part matters, because later people would try to rewrite the story. I didn't sit there thinking about Linda or the HOA or payback. I was thinking about water volume, ice melt rates, and sump capacity. I was thinking about Mrs. Pike sleeping through the night without alarms. I was thinking about Emily's equipment staying stable until grid power came back. The system didn't care about intent anyway. It operated on design. Zones with higher priority remained protected. Zones designed to accept overflow began to feel the strain they were engineered to handle. If someone wanted to call that unfair, they could argue with gravity. By the time the rain started falling on top of melting ice, everything was already in motion. The infrastructure was doing exactly what it had been built to do decades earlier. Back when engineers planned for worst-case scenarios instead of hoping authority would save them. I didn't flood anyone's home. I didn't punish anyone. I operated an emergency system under legal authorization, following documented procedures, with oversight and accountability. And if that reality made certain people uncomfortable, that wasn't my problem. Because when leadership fails, systems don't stop working. They just wait for someone qualified enough and careful enough to step in and do the job right. The storm didn't end all at once. It loosened its grip slowly, dangerously. Temperatures crept upward just enough to turn solid ice into runoff. And then the rain started, steady, cold, relentless. Snowbanks collapsed into slush. Gutters overflowed. This was the exact scenario the drainage system had been designed for, and it was already working at the edge of its limits. By the second day, reports started circulating. Basements in the lower zones were taking on water. Not catastrophically at first, damp floors, sump pumps running nonstop, that unmistakable smell of rising moisture. I monitored flow rates and pressure readings, making small adjustments exactly as the emergency procedures required. The priority zones remained stable. Medical homes stayed dry. Then Linda's house started flooding. Her property sat squarely in the lowest drainage zone. something she had never bothered to learn because it had never affected her before. Water pushed back through her sump line faster than her backup pump could handle. By afternoon, her basement carpet was soaked. By evening, water pooled against the walls. She came to my house just before dark. I saw her headlights before I heard her pounding on the door. When I opened it, she was red-faced and shaking, rain dripping from her coat, voice already raised. She accused me of sabotage, of deliberately flooding her home in retaliation for the generator dispute. She said she had witnesses. She said she would have me arrested. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I handed her copies of the county authorization, the emergency operations plan, and the documentation logs. I explained, calmly and clearly, that I was operating the drainage system under emergency management guidelines, prioritizing life safety, and adjusting flow according to design capacity. I explained that the system did not allow equal outcomes during peak melt conditions. It never had. She barely glanced at the paperwork. She said lawyers would handle it. Within 24 hours, her attorney sent a letter filled with threats, injunctions, lawsuits, personal liability claims. It was written to intimidate, not to stand up in court. I forwarded it to Susan Hale's office, along with my documentation. The response came back faster than I expected. Emergency statutes were clear. Interfering with authorized infrastructure operations during a declared emergency carried consequences. Targeting claims fell apart the moment my logs showed zone-based triage, timestamps, and oversight. The lawyer stopped responding. That didn't stop Linda. She pivoted to theater. HOA emails went out calling for an emergency meeting to address the dangerous actions of a resident. The wording was dramatic. Accusations were vague. Fear was the point. The goal wasn't truth, it was pressure. Neighbors started calling me, some confused, some scared, some angry. I didn't argue with any of them. I told them the same thing every time: attend the meeting, listen carefully, and ask questions. The meeting was scheduled for Sunday morning at Linda's house. The same house now running dehumidifiers and extension cords everywhere. Water damage visible through basement windows. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I arrived early with a folder under my arm and a calm I hadn't felt since before the storm. I wasn't there to defend myself emotionally. I was there to present facts. Linda opened the meeting with a speech about betrayal and abuse of power. She claimed I had taken control of community infrastructure without permission. She claimed residents were suffering because of me. She demanded I be removed from the neighborhood and barred from accessing any shared systems. Then she paused, waiting for applause. That's when the room shifted. A man I didn't recognize stood up near the back. He introduced himself quietly, showed identification, and said he needed to clarify a few things before the meeting continued. He explained that interference with emergency infrastructure involving medical equipment, combined with documented sabotage of utility connections, had triggered federal review. The word federal landed heavy. The room went silent. Linda's face drained of color as he explained that jurisdiction no longer rested solely at the HOA level. That actions taken during the storm were being evaluated for compliance with emergency law. That documentation mattered. That authority mattered. And that this meeting would not proceed the way she expected. For the first time since I moved to Frostvale Ridge, Linda didn't have control of the room. She looked at me like she finally understood something too late. The situation had outgrown her, and it wasn't going back under an HOA vote. The living room was packed. Folding chairs filled every corner, and people stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Some residents still smelled like damp carpet and mildew, coats draped over chairs, boots drying by vents. Others looked angry, exhausted, or shaken in that quiet way people get after they realize how close things came to going very wrong. The storm had passed. But the damage, physical and emotional, was still settling in. Linda stood at the front, positioned beneath a framed HOA charter like it was a badge of authority. A pump hummed somewhere below our feet, struggling to keep up. She launched into her speech without waiting for the room to fully settle. She talked about betrayal, about abuse of power, about how one resident had taken control of community systems and caused suffering. She never mentioned oxygen alarms. She never mentioned medical equipment. She never mentioned the generator cut. She pointed at me and demanded action. Before anyone could respond, the front door opened. A man stepped inside, calm and deliberate, water beading on his jacket as he shook it off. He introduced himself as Daniel Reyes, a federal infrastructure agent. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He displayed identification, then asked the room for a moment of attention. The shift was immediate. Agent Reyes explained that his office became involved for 3 reasons. First, documented interference with emergency power during a declared weather crisis affecting homes with medically necessary equipment. Second, physical sabotage of utility connections, an act that escalated the situation from civil dispute to potential criminal exposure. Third, irregularities uncovered during a preliminary review of HOA maintenance contracts, including payments routed through companies tied directly to Linda's household. Each point landed harder than the last. Linda tried to interrupt. He didn't let her. He described the documentation chain, timestamps, photographs, authorization letters, surveillance footage. He explained how emergency infrastructure law worked and why intent didn't matter when outcomes endangered lives. He made it clear that HOA authority did not override county or federal emergency management statutes. The room was silent except for the pump below us. Then he turned to the board members and explained their responsibilities and their exposure. Continuing to support interference or retaliation could carry consequences of its own. He recommended immediate suspension of Linda's authority pending investigation. No vote was needed. One board member stood up slowly and said they could not support Linda anymore. Another followed. Then another. The same people who had once nodded along to her enforcement emails now avoided eye contact, desperate to distance themselves. Linda's voice cracked as she tried to regain control. She accused everyone of turning on her. She called it a setup, a witch hunt. But rules are only powerful when they're real. The same language she had used to threaten neighbors. Compliance, authority, enforcement was now being spoken back to her by someone who actually had it. Her title meant nothing in that moment. Her clipboard sat forgotten on a side table, warped by moisture. Agent Reyes informed her that she was being removed from the board effective immediately, pending further review. He instructed her not to access HOA accounts, records, or infrastructure. Any attempt to interfere further would be documented. Charges, he said calmly, would be determined after a full investigation. Linda didn't shout after that. She didn't threaten. She simply sank into a chair, staring at the floor while the room exhaled around her. Some residents looked relieved. Others looked stunned. A few looked ashamed. For years, Linda had ruled through fear and selective enforcement. She had convinced herself that authority meant power without accountability, that rules were shields instead of responsibilities. In that room, with water damage creeping up the walls and federal authority standing quietly near the door, that illusion collapsed. The storm hadn't destroyed her. The rules she weaponized did. And for the first time since this began, the neighborhood wasn't arguing anymore. It was watching justice happen in real time. The days after the meeting felt strangely quiet, not peaceful exactly, but lighter, like the pressure in the neighborhood had finally released. Snowbanks melted into muddy piles along the roads, repair trucks rolled in and out, and the sound of generators faded as grid power returned for good. But the biggest change wasn't electrical. It was psychological. Within a week, the HOA was placed into temporary receivership. The remaining board members stepped down voluntarily, citing legal advice and the need for outside oversight. An independent management firm took control of finances, records, and maintenance contracts while investigations continued. Suddenly, the flood of threatening emails stopped. No more citations taped to doors. No more vague warnings written in bold font. Silence replaced intimidation. That silence said everything. One of the first things the receiver did was commission an emergency infrastructure review. Engineers and county officials walked the neighborhood with clipboards that actually mattered this time. They inspected drainage lines, backup power pathways, and the long, neglected manual control system in my backyard. Instead of pretending it didn't exist, they documented it, tested it, and formally integrated it into the county's emergency response plan. For the first time since Frostvale Ridge was built, the system worked the way it was supposed to. With oversight, training, and accountability, neighbors began reaching out. Some knocked on my door with awkward apologies. Others left notes in my mailbox. A few stood up at the next community meeting and apologized publicly for backing Linda or staying silent when the fines and threats started. I didn't hold grudges. Fear makes people freeze. That doesn't make them villains. It makes them human. What mattered was that they learned. Mrs. Pike made it through the storm without lasting harm. When I checked on her a few days later, her house was warm again, oxygen humming steadily. She held my hand longer than necessary and thanked me in a voice still thin but steady. That moment alone made every sleepless night worth it. Emily stabilized, too. Once power returned, her medical equipment ran normally again, and the tension that had been living in her shoulders slowly eased. We slept through the night for the first time since the storm hit. No alarms, no backup timers, just quiet. The receiver authorized grants for medical preparedness across the neighborhood. Households with elderly residents or medical needs received backup battery systems and generator subsidies. Sump pump backups were standardized. Emergency contact trees were created. Real protocols replaced empty authority. Linda's house was repaired eventually. Insurance handled what it would. The rest became part of an ongoing investigation I wasn't involved in anymore. I didn't follow the details closely. That chapter wasn't mine to write. People sometimes asked me if I felt bad about what happened to her. I told them the truth. I didn't flood anyone out of revenge. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to punish my neighbors. I operated a system that existed long before I arrived, under legal authorization, with one goal: protect life when leadership failed. Water followed gravity. Consequences followed actions. I didn't need to raise my voice, break rules, or fight dirty. I let documentation speak. I let law stand where threats collapsed. And I let physics do what it always does, move exactly the way it was designed to. Frostvale Ridge isn't perfect now. No neighborhood is. But it's safer, quieter, more honest. People look out for each other in ways they didn't before, because they understand how close they came to disaster. When the next storm comes, and it will, this community won't rely on fear or fake authority to get through it. It will rely on preparation, responsibility, and systems that work. That's the difference between control and leadership. And it's a lesson this neighborhood won't forget. When everything finally settled, I kept thinking about how close this neighborhood came to real tragedy. Not because of the storm, but because of ego. Weather doesn't have favorites. ICE doesn't check bylaws. Emergencies expose the difference between people who want authority and people who accept responsibility. Linda wanted control. That was always the point. Control over rules, over neighbors, over situations she didn't fully understand. She ignored design because it didn't flatter her authority. She ignored people because compassion doesn't fit neatly on a clipboard. And she ignored consequences because, for a long time, she never had to face them. Preparedness isn't loud. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't posture. It works quietly in the background, waiting for the moment it's needed. Real systems don't bend to power trips. They follow physics, documentation, and law. Every single time. I didn't win anything here. I didn't come out feeling triumphant. What I felt was relief. Relief that my wife slept safely through the night. Relief that Mrs. Pike was still breathing easily in her own bed. Relief that a neighborhood finally learned that leadership isn't about enforcing rules when it's easy, but protecting people when it's hard. Water doesn't care who's in charge. Gravity doesn't respect titles. And the law doesn't protect people who confuse authority with entitlement. If this story proves anything, it's that patience, preparation, and doing things the right way will always outlast intimidation. You don't have to be loud to be powerful. You just have to be right and ready. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Gone Wild. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?